The scent of freshly cut grass and sizzling barbecue hung in the warm evening air of Maple Creek, a suburb so idyllic it felt like a movie set. White picket fences lined manicured lawns, children's bicycles lay discarded on driveways, and the soft glow of porch lights created halos in the deepening twilight. At the heart of this perfect picture, on a sprawling deck decorated with fairy lights, stood Mark Chandler. He was the king of this castle, and tonight he was in his element. Mark was, by all accounts, a man who had everything. At 35, he possessed a kind, open face, a sturdy build from his weekend warrior hobbies, and an easy laugh that made people feel instantly at home. He was a successful architect, a partner at a growing firm downtown, a man who could see the beauty in structure and design, a quality he applied to his own life with meticulous care. His greatest creation, the one he was most proud of, was the life he had built right here. He flipped a row of perfectly marinated steaks on the grill, the sizzle a satisfying soundtrack to the evening. His wife, Jessica, was gliding through the small crowd of friends they'd gathered for their annual summer kickoff party. Jessica was his masterpiece. She was stunning, with honey blonde hair that caught the light and intelligent blue eyes that could be both warm and calculating, though Mark only ever saw the warmth. She was a freelance graphic designer, a job that allowed her the flexibility to be the perfect hostess, the attentive wife, the envy of the neighborhood. Her laughter, a light, musical sound, drifted over to him, and he smiled. By his side, nursing a craft beer, was David Chun, Mark's best friend since they were awkward teenagers building model rockets in a dusty garage. David was the third pillar of their life, an inseparable part of the Mark and Jessica equation. He was leaner than Mark, with a quick, restless energy and a sharp, cynical wit that complemented Mark's earnest nature perfectly. A high school history teacher, David often joked that he was the underachieving intellectual of the group, but his bond with Mark was unshakable. They had been through everything together. First cars, first heartbreaks, college all-nighters, and now this comfortable, successful adulthood. David had been the best man at their wedding, his speech a perfect blend of humor and heartfelt emotion that had brought the entire room to tears. He was Uncle David to the children they planned to have, a permanent fixture at their dinner table, the brother Mark never had. "Careful you don't burn those, Picasso," David quipped, gesturing with his bottle at the steaks. "Those are prime cuts. An affront to the cow to char them." Mark laughed, clapping him on the shoulder. "An artist is never careless, my friend. It's called caramelization. You, a humble history teacher, wouldn't understand the complex science." He looked out at the scene, the comfortable chatter of friends, his beautiful wife topping up someone's wine glass, the warm glow of his perfect home, and felt a wave of profound contentment. "Can you believe this, Dave? Sometimes I have to pinch myself." David's smile was a fraction of a second too slow, a subtle shift that Mark, in his bliss, didn't notice. "You built it, man. You deserve it." David's eyes followed Mark's, landing on Jessica. She looked up at that exact moment, and her eyes met David's over the rim of a wine glass. It was a fleeting glance, no longer than a heartbeat, but it held a universe of unspoken meaning. It was a look of shared secrets, of quiet understanding, a look that was not meant for Mark. The perfect life, like any meticulously designed structure, had hidden stresses, hairline fractures invisible to the casual observer. For Mark, the foundation was solid granite. For Jessica and David, it was beginning to feel like a cage. The dissatisfaction had been a slow-growing vine, creeping into the sunlit garden of their lives. For Jessica, it was the suffocating predictability. She had once been a promising artist with a scholarship to a prestigious art school in the city, a dream she had deferred, then abandoned, for the comfortable security Mark offered. He had encouraged her to follow her passion, but his vision of that passion was a small, manageable home studio, not a chaotic, paint-splattered loft in the city. He loved the idea of having a creative, artistic wife, but the reality of a struggling artist's life, the uncertainty, the financial instability, was anathema to his carefully planned world. She designed logos for local bakeries and dentists, her creativity confined to a 2 by 2 inch digital box, while her canvases collected dust in the attic. She played the part of the happy suburban wife, but inside, she was suffocating. For David, the resentment was more complex. He loved Mark like a brother, but love and envy were not mutually exclusive. While Mark's career had soared, David felt stuck in a professional rut, explaining the fall of the Roman Empire to teenagers who were more interested in their phones. He saw the ease with which Mark moved through the world, the casual confidence that came with financial success, and it gnawed at him. He was always the sidekick, the plus one, the witty friend who was great to have at parties but went home to a quiet, empty apartment. He felt like a supporting character in the grand production of Mark's life. Their shared discontent had become a secret bond. It started with quiet complaints after Mark had gone to bed, Jessica and David lingering over a last glass of wine. Jessica would confess her creative frustrations. David would voice his professional anxieties. Their talks became a clandestine ritual, a pocket of reality in a world of performance. They were the only ones who saw the cracks in the facade because they were the ones living in them. "He's a good man," Jessica had whispered one night, swirling the dregs of a Merlot in her glass. The party lights were off, the house was dark, and the only sound was the hum of the refrigerator. "He's kind and generous, and he loves me. I feel so guilty for wanting more." "Wanting to be yourself isn't a crime," David had replied, his voice low. His hand had found hers on the table, his thumb tracing circles on her skin. It was the first time they had crossed that line, a simple touch that felt as loud as a gunshot in the silent house. "You're not a piece of his collection, Jess. You're a masterpiece." The idea, when it first took root, was not murder. It was escape. They fantasized about it during their late-night talks, their whispers weaving a narrative of a different life. A life where Jessica was a celebrated artist in the city, where David was with her. The fantasy grew more detailed, more alluring. But there was always the insurmountable obstacle, Mark. He would never understand. A divorce would be a messy, public failure, a demolition of the perfect life he had so carefully constructed. And financially, Jessica would be left with very little. The house, the savings, the investments were all products of Mark's success, tied up in his name and a prenuptial agreement he had gently but firmly insisted upon. The conversation that changed everything happened on a rainy Tuesday night about a month before the barbecue. Mark was out of town at a conference. Jessica and David were sharing a pizza on the living room floor, the TV a flickering, silent backdrop. "I was updating our insurance policies today," Jessica said, her voice casual, but her eyes fixed on the pizza box. "Mark likes to review them every year. He increased his life insurance again. He says it's for my peace of mind." She let out a short, bitter laugh. "He has no idea what would give me peace of mind." David stopped chewing. He looked at her, his expression unreadable. "How much?" $5 million, she said softly. Tax-free. The number hung in the air between them, heavy and obscene. $5 million. It was not just money. It was freedom. It was a new life, a blank canvas, a complete erasure of the past. It was the solution to every problem, the answer to every frustrated prayer. The fantasy of escape suddenly had a budget. "It's just a thought," she said quickly, as if to take the words back. But the thought was already there, a seed planted in the fertile ground of their shared resentment. They didn't speak of it again for days, but the silence was loud with it. It was in their shared glances, in the way they carefully steered conversations away from the future, in the palpable tension that now charged their secret meetings. The plan began to form in whispers, in hypotheticals, in conversations cloaked in deniability. If something were to happen to him, became their mantra. David, the history teacher, became a meticulous researcher. He spent his nights reading about untraceable poisons, staged accidents, and police procedures. He learned about lividity and rigor mortis, about cell phone tracking and digital footprints. Jessica, the designer, focused on the aesthetics of the aftermath, on the performance of grief. They were collaborators on their most ambitious project yet. The annual solo camping trip Mark took every summer was the perfect opportunity. He loved escaping to the rugged wilderness of the Blackwood National Forest for a few days, a tradition he'd maintained since college. He would be alone, miles from civilization, unreachable. It was the perfect stage. At the barbecue, as Mark laughed and held court by the grill, Jessica and David were putting the final touches on their plan. Their interactions were flawless, a masterclass in deception. "You really should go for the whole week this year," David said to Mark, his voice full of friendly encouragement. "You've been working so hard. Disconnect completely. No phone, no email. Just you and the bears." "Jessica would never allow it," Mark chuckled. "Of course I would," Jessica chimed in, walking over and wrapping her arms around Mark's waist. She kissed his cheek, a perfect imitation of a loving wife. "David's right. You need a real break. We'll all be right here when you get back." The plan was simple and they believed foolproof. David would go with Mark on the first day, a last hurrah before Mark went completely off-grid. They would hike to a remote spot. There, David would incapacitate Mark with a sedative slipped into his whiskey, something that would mimic a medical event and metabolize quickly. Then, he would stage a fatal fall from a rocky outcrop. He would leave Mark's phone and gear behind, hike back under the cover of darkness, and establish his alibi. Jessica, meanwhile, would play the role of the slightly annoyed but ultimately supportive wife. She would tell friends that Mark had insisted on his no-contact rule for the first few days. She wouldn't report him missing until 3, maybe 4 days had passed, giving them ample time and making her concern seem genuine when it finally came. The week after the party was a blur of final preparations. Jessica was overly affectionate with Mark, packing his favorite snacks, making sure he had new hiking boots, playing the part of the doting wife to the hilt. Mark, oblivious, soaked it all in, feeling like the luckiest man in the world. He was touched by how supportive both his wife and his best friend were of his trip. The morning he was set to leave, the sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue. Jessica walked him to his truck, David already sitting in the passenger seat, a duffel bag at his feet. "Now, you two be safe," she said, her voice catching with just the right amount of emotion. She kissed Mark deeply, a long, lingering kiss that was both a promise and a lie. "I'll miss you. I'll miss you too," he said, holding her face in his hands. "I love you more than anything." "I love you too," she whispered. Over his shoulder, her eyes met David's. David gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. Mark climbed into the driver's seat, his face beaming with excitement. "Blackwood Forest, here we come," he boomed, turning the key. The engine roared to life. Jessica stood on the perfect lawn of her perfect house, waving as the truck pulled away, a single artfully produced tear tracing a path down her cheek. She held the wave until the truck was out of sight, the very picture of a loving wife saying a temporary goodbye. The moment it disappeared around the corner, her arm dropped. The tear was wiped away. Her expression became a blank canvas, her blue eyes as clear and cold as a winter sky. The performance had begun. The first 48 hours were a masterclass in calculated silence. Jessica moved through her days with a quiet, practiced calm. She went to her yoga class, had lunch with a friend, and worked on a logo for a new dental practice. When anyone asked about Mark, she would offer a small, slightly weary smile. "Oh, he's off the grid," she'd say, a hint of affectionate exasperation in her voice. "He's taken this whole disconnecting from technology thing to a new level this year. Honestly, I'm half expecting him to come back with a beard and wearing animal skins. He and David went up together yesterday, but I think David was only staying for the one night." She was carefully laying the groundwork, seeding the narrative. She established that Mark was alone, that he was deliberately out of contact, and that David had left him to it. Every word was a carefully placed brick in the wall of their alibi. David, for his part, had returned late the previous night, his car covered in dust, his face etched with a convincing exhaustion. He had immediately sent a text to a group chat of their friends, made it back from Blackwood, left Mark to his solitude. "That man is half mountain goat. I'm hitting the sack for 12 hours. He then turned his phone off. He spent the next day at home, grading papers, ordering a pizza, and deliberately creating a digital footprint of mundane domesticity. The reality of their shared 24 hours in the forest was a stark, brutal counterpoint. The hike had been filled with a strange tension. Mark, oblivious, had chattered on about his plans for a new extension on the house, while David had answered in monosyllables, his mind a frantic, repeating loop of the steps he had memorized. The moment had come as the sun began to set, casting long, eerie shadows through the trees. They had set up a small camp near a dramatic cliff edge overlooking a river, the very spot David had scouted weeks earlier. Mark, flushed with exertion and the beauty of the wilderness, had pulled out a flask of expensive single malt whiskey. To the wild, Mark had toasted, his voice echoing in the quiet woods. To the wild, David had repeated, his own heart hammering against his ribs. He had watched as Mark took a long, deep swallow from the flask. The same flask David had carefully filled and laced with a powerful, tasteless sedative just an hour before, while Mark was gathering firewood. The effect was faster than David had anticipated. Mark's words began to slur. He complained of a sudden, overwhelming dizziness, a crushing fatigue. Must have pushed it too hard today, he'd mumbled, slumping against a log. He had looked at David, his eyes full of confusion and a flicker of fear. Dave, I don't feel so good. Those were his last words. Within minutes, he was unconscious. The rest was a blur of grim, methodical work. There was no rage, no passion, just a cold, terrifying efficiency. David, fueled by adrenaline, had dragged his lifelong friend's dead weight to the edge of the cliff. He checked for a pulse, finding none. Then, with a grunt of effort, he had pushed him over. The sound of the body hitting the rocks below was sickeningly final. He had then scattered some of Mark's gear near the edgy water bottle, a map to create the impression of a tragic, accidental fall. He had hiked the long miles back to his car in the dark, his mind a chillingly blank slate, refusing to process the enormity of what he had done. He was no longer David Chun, history teacher. He was a murderer. On the third day, Jessica began her performance in earnest. It started with a single, worried text to David. Have you heard from Mark at all? I know he wanted to be off-grid, but I'm starting to get a little anxious. No, nothing. But you know him. He's probably wrestling a bear. David had texted back, their pre-written script playing out perfectly. She allowed another few hours to pass before she began making phone calls. First to a few close friends, her voice laced with a carefully controlled worry. I'm probably just being silly, she'd say. But Mark was supposed to at least send a smoke signal by now. Has he reached out to you? The answer was always no. By evening, her controlled worry had escalated to a convincing panic. She called the park ranger station for Blackwood National Forest. Her voice was frantic, breathless. My husband, Mark Chandler, he went camping. He was supposed to check in. He's not answering his phone. I'm so worried something has happened. The official search began the next morning. Jessica was at the ranger station at dawn, her face pale, her eyes red-rimmed and puffy. She had stayed up all night, crying on cue and staring at the phone. David arrived shortly after, his expression a mask of grim concern. He immediately took charge, his feigned grief manifesting as proactive strength. He was the rock, the supportive best friend stepping up in a crisis. We need to organize a volunteer search party, he announced to the group of friends who had gathered. Mark knows this area, but anything can happen. We need to cover as much ground as possible. He was magnificent. He coordinated with the rangers, printed maps, and assigned search grids. He spoke to the local news reporters who had started to arrive, his voice steady but thick with emotion. Mark is my brother, he told a reporter from Channel 4 News, his hand resting protectively on Jessica's shoulder. He's a fighter. We're going to find him. We just need to bring him home. Jessica, for her part, played the role of the crumbling wife flawlessly. She would break down in sobs, burying her face in David's shoulder, only to pull herself together with a visible effort, her voice trembling as she thanked the volunteers. Thank you all for being here, she wept. He loves you all so much. He would do the same for any of you. The community rallied around them. Casseroles and condolences flooded the perfect house in Maple Creek. The story of the handsome architect, lost in the wilderness, and his beautiful, devastated wife was a local tragedy. A story of love and cruel fate that everyone followed with bated breath. Leading the official investigation was Detective Miles Corbin, a 20-year veteran of the force with weary eyes that had seen every shade of human depravity. His partner, Detective Lena Hansen, was younger, sharper, and tended to see the world in clearer shades of black and white. From the start, something about Jessica and David felt off to Corbin. Grief was a messy, unpredictable emotion. It made people irrational, angry, catatonic. Jessica's and David's grief, however, felt polished. It was the Hollywood version of grief. Every tear seemed to fall on cue. Every emotional breakdown happened in front of an audience. "It's a little too perfect, isn't it?" Corbin remarked to Hansen as they watched Jessica's tearful plea on the evening news. "She looks like she's auditioning for a role." "Give her a break, Miles," Hansen countered. "Her husband is missing, presumed dead. She's in shock. And the friend, David? He's just trying to be strong for her. It's what people do." Corbin grunted, unconvinced. "Maybe. Or maybe they're putting on a show." On the third day of the search, a ranger found the scene. The scattered gear, the scuff marks near the cliff edge, and, tragically, Mark Chandler's body, broken on the rocks below. The news was delivered to Jessica and David in the hushed, somber incident room at the ranger station. Jessica's reaction was a primal scream of anguish that echoed through the building, a sound so raw and convincing that it sent a chill down Detective Hansen's spine. She collapsed into a sobbing heap, David catching her just before she hit the floor, holding her as she shook with what appeared to be uncontrollable grief. Even Corbin had to admit it was a powerful performance. The narrative was set. Mark Chandler, an experienced but perhaps overly confident hiker, had slipped and fallen to his death in a tragic accident. The case was, for all intents and purposes, closed before it had even been fully opened. The funeral was a week later. The entire town of Maple Creek seemed to be in attendance. The church was overflowing with mourners, their faces a sea of sorrow. Jessica, veiled in black, was a portrait of tragic widowhood, leaning heavily on David's arm. David delivered the eulogy. His voice, cracking with emotion, painted a picture of a loyal friend, a loving husband, a man full of life, cut down in his prime. "Mark wasn't just my friend," David said, his eyes scanning the tear-streaked faces in the pews. "He was my compass. He was the best of us. And I don't know how any of us are supposed to navigate this world without him." He looked directly at Jessica, his expression one of profound, shared loss. "But we will for him. And we'll be there for you, Jess. Always." It was a beautiful, heartbreaking speech. People wept openly. Detective Corbin, standing in the back of the church, just watched. He watched the way David's hand lingered on Jessica's back. He watched the way they communicated without words, their bodies moving in a synchronized dance of shared grief. It was intimate, too intimate. The weeks that followed saw David become a permanent fixture at Jessica's house. His car was always in the driveway. He mowed the lawn, fixed a leaky faucet, and took care of all the things Mark used to do. To the outside world, he was a hero, the best friend a man could ever ask for, stepping up to care for his fallen friend's widow. But behind the closed doors of the perfect house, the performance was beginning to take its toll. The constant act of mourning was exhausting. The relief and exhilaration they had expected to feel were absent, replaced by a gnawing paranoia. Every knock on the door, every phone call from an unknown number, sent a jolt of fear through them. They argued in hushed, vicious whispers. "You were too theatrical at the ranger station," David hissed one night, after they had finished another casserole left on their doorstep. "That scream was over the top." "Over the top?" Jessica shot back, her voice a venomous whisper. "You were practically accepting an Oscar for your eulogy. He was my compass? Please. You couldn't find your way out of a paper bag without a GPS. The money, The entire reason for their monstrous act was another source of contention. The $5 million insurance policy was tied up in paperwork and investigations, a standard procedure for a payout of that size. The freedom they had killed for was still tantalizingly out of reach. "They're taking too long," Jessica fretted constantly. "What if they're looking into us?" "Relax," David would say, though his own anxiety was a constant, bitter taste in his mouth. "It's just protocol. We just have to keep playing our parts. The grieving widow and the loyal friend. We just have to hold on a little longer." But Detective Corbin was not letting go. The official cause of death had been ruled as blunt force trauma consistent with a fall. But a small detail in the preliminary toxicology report had snagged his attention. Along with the alcohol in Mark's system, the lab had found trace amounts of a benzodiazepine derivative, a powerful sedative. It wasn't enough to kill him, but it would have been more than enough to make him drowsy, disoriented, and dangerously clumsy. It was not a drug Mark had a prescription for. It was a tiny loose thread, but for Corbin it was enough. He began to pull on it, convinced that with enough pressure, the entire, perfectly woven tapestry of lies would unravel. He started a quiet, off-the-books deep dive into the lives of Jessica Chandler and David Chun, looking for the rot beneath the pristine surface of their perfect lives. He had a feeling he was going to find it. The first thread Detective Corbin pulled was financial. He obtained a warrant to look into Mark and Jessica Chandler's accounts, and the $5 million life insurance policy was the first thing that jumped out. While not inherently suspicious on its own, the timing was. It had been activated just 6 weeks before Mark's death. The premiums were being paid out of their joint account, but the payment notifications were being sent to a new P.O. box, not their home address. Mark had likely never even seen the final policy documents. Next, Corbin looked at David Chin. A high school history teacher's salary was modest, yet for the past few months, David had been living well beyond his means. There were expensive dinners, a new designer watch, and a down payment on a new sports car, all paid for in cash. When Corbin's team dug deeper, they found it. A secret joint savings account, opened under a shell LLC, in the names of Jessica Chandler and David Chun. For the past 6 months, Jessica had been siphoning money from her and Mark's household account into this secret fund. It was the seed money for their new life. "This isn't grief," Corbin said to Hansen, pointing at the damning bank statements spread across his desk. "This is a business plan." While the financial evidence was mounting, the forensic team was re-examining the physical evidence from the accident scene. The trace amounts of sedative in Mark's system were the biggest red flag. How did it get there? Corbin had his team search Mark's truck, which had been impounded since the investigation began. Tucked deep inside a side pocket of David's duffel bag, which he'd forgotten in his haste to get back, they found a small, empty vial. The label had been peeled off, but residue analysis provided the smoking gun. It was the same powerful, fast-acting benzodiazepine found in Mark's blood. The final piece of the physical puzzle came from an unexpected source. A geological survey team had been working in a remote part of Blackwood Forest around the time of Mark's death, using high-resolution satellite imagery to map the terrain. On a hunch, Corbin requested their archives. After days of painstaking analysis, they found it. A single, grainy image, time-stamped at 8:07 p.m. on the night of Mark's death. It showed Mark's campsite, and in the twilight, 2 figures were clearly visible near the cliff edge. Not 1, 2. "They're liars," Hansen breathed, staring at the image on the monitor. The sympathy she'd once felt for Jessica and David had evaporated, replaced by a cold fury. He never left Mark alone. Corbin now had means, motive, and opportunity. He had the poison, the money, and the proof that David's alibi was a lie. But he wanted more. He wanted a confession. He knew that the weakest point in any conspiracy was the trust between the conspirators. He decided to break them apart. They brought them in simultaneously in separate cars for a few follow-up questions. They were placed in 2 different interrogation rooms on opposite ends of the station. The perfect image they had maintained for weeks began to crumble the moment they were separated. Corbin started with David. He walked into the stark, windowless room and dropped a file onto the metal table between them. David flinched. "David, we know you didn't leave Mark alone in the forest," Corbin began, his voice calm and conversational. He slid a copy of the satellite photo across the table. "We know you were with him when he died." David stared at the photo, the blood draining from his face. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. "We also found this in your bag," Corbin continued, placing an evidence bag containing the empty vial on top of the photo. "And we found the secret bank accounts. We know about the plan." David began to tremble, his carefully constructed composure shattering like glass. "Here's the thing, David," Corbin said, leaning in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "We see guys like you all the time. Smart, quiet guys who get manipulated by a charismatic woman. Jessica planned this, didn't she? The insurance, the money. She pushed you into it. She told you what to do. Right now, in the room down the hall, she's telling Detective Hansen her own version of the story. And in her version, you're the monster. You're the one who couldn't stand living in Mark's shadow. You're the one who was obsessed with her, who cooked up this whole scheme to get Mark out of the way so you could have his wife and his money." Corbin paused, letting the words sink in. "Her story sounds pretty convincing, David. She's a good actress. We've all seen it. Unless you give us a reason to believe otherwise, you're going to be the one taking the fall for this. Alone." Meanwhile, in the other room, Detective Hansen was using the same strategy on Jessica. "The game is up, Jessica," Hansen said, her tone sharp and unforgiving. "We know about the insurance policy. We know you were stealing from your husband for months. We know David never left the forest." Jessica's face was a mask of practiced indignation. "I have no idea what you're talking about. David was a wonderful friend to Mark. He would never save it." Hansen cut her off. "David's in the other room right now, telling us everything. He's saying this was all your idea. He's saying you were so desperate to get out of your perfect life that you manipulated him into helping you. He says he never wanted to hurt Mark, but you pushed him, threatened him. He's painting a very vivid picture of you as a cold, greedy puppeteer. And honestly, it's easy to believe." Jessica's eyes widened, a flicker of genuine panic finally breaking through her facade. The thought that David, her co-conspirator, her partner, would betray her was the one scenario she hadn't prepared for. Her loyalty was only to herself, and she assumed his was the same. "He's lying," she hissed. "It was him. He was always so jealous of Mark. He was obsessed with me, he followed me everywhere. He was the one who kept talking about the insurance, about how easy it would be. He killed Mark, and he scared me into keeping quiet. It was the opening Hansen was waiting for." Over the next 2 hours, both Jessica and David, believing the other had already betrayed them, gave detailed, self-serving confessions. They admitted to the plot, to the murder, but each painted the other as the mastermind, the true villain. David confessed to pushing Mark from the cliff, but claimed Jessica had masterminded the entire plot. Jessica confessed to the financial planning and the seduction, but insisted David was the one who had insisted on murder over a simple disappearance. Their stories, filled with vitriol and blame, sealed both their fates. The trial was a media sensation. The story of the beautiful, grieving widow and the loyal best friend, who were actually cold-blooded killers, captivated the public. The perfect life they had presented to the world was systematically dismantled in court, revealing the ugly truths of greed, resentment, and betrayal that lay beneath. Their attempts to blame each other in their testimony only served to make them both look more monstrous. They were found guilty on all counts: conspiracy, insurance fraud, and first-degree murder. As the verdict was read, they didn't look at each other. The bond that had been forged in whispered secrets and sealed with a man's life was now irrevocably broken, replaced by a mutual, seething hatred. They were sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The perfect house in Maple Creek was sold, its manicured lawn eventually growing wild. The friends who had brought them casseroles and cried at Mark's funeral were left with the chilling knowledge that they had offered their sympathy to killers. The story became a cautionary tale, a dark legend in the idyllic town. It served as a horrifying testament to the fact that the most dangerous monsters are not strangers lurking in the shadows, but the ones who smile at you from across the dinner table, the ones who know your secrets, and the ones you believe until it's too late that you can trust with your life.